Story 1.
Ethan could have called this evening just another ordinary one. He had come home, as usual, at night, tired of the dull school conversations that were becoming harder and harder to handle. Tonight, among his friends, a new topic had arisen, something truly terrifying, something that had settled in their minds like a dark shadow. The scary story told by one of them had become not just a tale, but a full-blown nightmare. And no matter how hard he tried, that story wouldn't leave Ethan's mind. It kept spinning in his head, filling every movement with anxiety. He closed the window, pulled a small flashlight out of his backpack, turned it on, and illuminated the dark corners of his room, as though afraid that someone might appear, casting their shadow. Of course, nothing was there. He knew this, but still, his thoughts kept returning to what one of his friends had said. The story of how nighttime entities sneak up on you, waiting for the moment you fall asleep, their eyes filled with hatred, watching you like prey. Their eyes filled with hatred, watching you like prey. Only shadows melting into darkness. Only shadows melting into darkness. It kept spinning in his head, filling every movement with anxiety. He closed the window, pulled a small flashlight out of his backpack, turned it on, and illuminated the dark corners of his room, as though afraid that someone might appear, casting their shadow. Only shadows melting into dark. He knew he was soon leaving for camp, where a new day awaited him, full of adventures. But the thoughts of what might happen at night consumed his mind, and the words that stayed with him repeated endlessly in his head, like a broken record. She will come at night. This was something he couldn't shake. The feeling it gave him was unbearable. She, the sinister presence, always near. Outside the window, the wind howled, quiet, like a restless soul that cannot find peace. The distant barking of a dog seemed to come from somewhere far away, as if some unseen thing was wandering through the dark corners of the city. Ethan stood up from his bed, his gaze flicking around the room, pausing on every detail. The blanket, the door, the open window. It felt as though some invisible force had been watching him the entire time, waiting for his consciousness to slip away from the moment. The ticking of the clock from the neighboring room seemed louder than usual, sharp, almost unbearable. It grew in its regularity, disrupting the silence, making his heart beat faster. And then he realized that something old, forgotten, yet unbearably familiar, was starting to emerge in his mind. Memories from another rainy evening, 3 years ago, when he was still a little boy. Back then, it was also raining. Back then, he had heard footsteps that couldn't have been real. That evening had never given him peace, but now everything seemed even clearer. Recalling the sound of the footsteps, Ethan felt his skin crawl with cold sweat. He remembered standing in that ominous rainy evening, completely alone, helpless. He couldn't do anything. And now, when those footsteps echoed again in his memory, fear gripped him with new intensity. He clenched his teeth, trying not to think about what awaited him, refusing to let these memories overpower him once more. But Ethan's gaze moved back to the window. He stood up, reached out his hand to close the window. But in that moment, his eyes fell on something, or someone. In the dark, in the faint light of the flashlight, he noticed something, or someone, a black shadow, slowly spreading across the glass, as if merging with the night's darkness that dared to enter his home. His heart began to beat even harder. The smile on the glass was no longer just terrifying. It was the omen of something horrifying that was beginning to unfold. He took a step back, but his legs seemed to move on their own, and he was trapped, surrounded by invisible shadows.
Story 2.
I don't know how much time had passed since I moved into that cramped room on the outskirts of the city before I noticed the 3 windows in the building across the street. They were always lit, every night, without exception. I must have noticed it after 3 months of sleepless nights spent studying. Every time I got up to take a break from the screen, I inevitably found myself at the window. And always my gaze landed on those 3 cursed windows. The light in them burned no matter how deep the night was. The building opposite looked abandoned. It was low, only 4 stories tall, and vaguely resembled an old school. One day, I decided to take a closer look. No signs, no indications of life. The doors, massive, metal, covered in rust, looked like they hadn't been opened in years. They were locked tight. Apart from those 3 windows on the top floor, nothing suggested that anyone was inside. I tried to peer through the windows on the first floor, but the glass was murky, obscured by thick curtains. Yet the closer I got, the stronger the sense of unease grew inside me. The 4th month of my observations changed everything. One night, as I stood at my window, my eyes unconsciously fixated on them. Suddenly, in the leftmost window, a silhouette appeared. Clear, motionless. There was no curtain, nothing separating it from the glass. In the dim light, it appeared utterly black, faceless, featureless. But even from that distance, I felt it staring at me, and it saw me. After that night, I couldn't tear my eyes away from that window. Every night, it stood there. I knew it couldn't be just a person. It was too unnatural. One night, driven by some unknown impulse, I slowly raised my hand and touched the glass, and it did the same. Perfectly synchronized, as if it had been waiting for me to do it. A chilling horror gripped me. I yanked the curtain shut and backed away, feeling my heart pounding violently in my chest. I didn't sleep at all that night, but that was only the beginning. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that nothing unusual had happened. Maybe it had simply mimicked my movement by chance. Maybe it was just an ordinary person. To dispel my fears once and for all, I decided to repeat the experiment the following night. I approached the window and touched the glass. It didn't move. A wave of relief washed over me. I turned away and froze. In the reflection on the wall, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a silhouette, but it wasn't mine. It was his. the contours I knew too well. I slowly turned my head back toward the window. It began to lift its hand. In the reflection, I saw the dark figure doing the same. Second by second, terrifyingly slowly, its fingers crept toward the edge of the window frame. I knew that if it touched the glass, everything would change. I don't remember losing consciousness. I woke up the next morning on the floor beneath the window. Its silhouette still lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the horrifying memory. At the moment I fell, I could have sworn it was no longer outside the window, but on my side of it. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the price. I just wanted to sell that apartment as quickly as possible. A buyer came along within a few months. I never returned to that neighborhood again, avoiding it at all costs. 2 years later, in the autumn, I accidentally ran into an old neighbor. We talked, and what he told me kept me awake for several nights. The young man who had bought my apartment was found dead. No signs of violence, just a heart failure. He died at night, alone, by the window. And now I can't get rid of two thoughts. First, I am responsible for his death. Second, what if this isn't over?
Story 3.
I had finally moved out of the apartment where I had lived with my friends since school and rented a small one-bedroom place. After renovation, it felt clean, fresh, empty. The owners had taken almost all the furniture with them, leaving only a table and a couple of chairs. That didn't bother me. I longed for solitude, wanted to feel like the master of my own space, even if just for a night. Late in the evening, carrying a blanket, my laptop, and a bottle of beer, I entered the apartment. The silence was absolute. A hollow, ringing vacuum. There was something wrong about it, but I brushed off the unease. I was just used to the noise of neighbors, the voices of friends. Silence felt unnatural. I settled on the floor, poured some beer, lit a cigarette, stepped out onto the balcony. The wind scattered the city lights, making them dance in the windows. It seemed like the city was alive on its own, unaware of my existence. When I returned to the room, I found an unprotected Wi-Fi network. Perfect. In the dark, illuminated only by my laptop screen, I sipped beer, smoked, and browsed the internet mindlessly. It went on until 2 in the morning when I stumbled upon a link. Photos you can never unsee. Some creepy nonsense. But I clicked. I was drawn into the archive. Catastrophes, war, death. I stared at these images, unable to look away. And then one burned itself into my mind. Chemical plant disaster, a shallow grave, and in it, a dead man. The body bloated, decomposing, mouth open. But the worst part was the eyes. They were looking, not at me, through me. I felt the air in the room grow heavy, as if a dark film covered the walls. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the photograph, couldn't blink. The dead eyes grew larger, filling the entire screen. And suddenly I realized, this wasn't a photo. It was a window into the void, and something there was looking back. I slammed my laptop shut, exhaled sharply. Nonsense, just pictures. My nerves were playing tricks. Trying to distract myself, I stepped into the hallway and froze. The door. I had closed it. I was sure I had closed it, but now it was slightly ajar. A 10-centimeter gap, blacker than the unlit hallway beyond. The darkness behind the door was too thick, unnatural. It didn't fade into the ambient light. It devoured it, greedily swallowing every ray, leaving behind a sticky void. I couldn't breathe. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and immediately wished I hadn't. The light didn't pierce the darkness. It simply vanished into it. Instantly, like a drop in a black ocean. I knew something was there. I could feel its gaze. I could feel it approaching. With a shaking hand, I switched the camera to live view mode so I could see the hallway only through the screen. And I saw a silhouette, tall, inhumanly thin. It stood in the hallway, 10 steps away. I couldn't see it with my own eyes, but the phone screen didn't lie. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if examining me. I stared. I couldn't stop staring. My breath caught in my throat. The silhouette took a step forward. I don't remember slamming the door shut. I don't remember how I ended up on the floor, clutching my phone to my chest. I was shaking. My hair stood on end. I was afraid to blink, afraid to hear something beyond the door, afraid that the door would start opening again. Now I know what true fear is. I am never alone anymore. I can never be alone, because when it's dark, something is watching from the corners of the room, waiting.